Hello and Tashtale to all the class 12 students. So far in our chapter number 2, sexual reproduction in flowering plants, we have been discussing about the male reproductive part and the female reproductive part of the flower. Okay, and we have also discussed about the formation of male gametophyte, that is pollen grains, and the formation of female gametophyte, that is embryo sac. Now remember, inside the pollen grain we have the male gametes, and inside the embryo sac we have the female gamete. Now if you look at the structure of pollen grains and embryo sac, they are both non-motile. They cannot move on their own. And for the fertilization to happen, the male gamete and the female gamete, they need to come close to each other. Right? Now how will that happen, since both of them, they are non-motile structures? Right? How will the male gamete and female gamete come together for fertilization? That happens by a process known as pollination. I hope you have heard about pollination in your previous classes, right? So pollination, the definition of pollination is the transfer of pollen grains shed from the anther to the stigma of a pistil is termed as pollination. So you can note down the definition of pollination. Okay, so you know that pollen grains are within the anther. And when the anther bursts open, the pollen grains are released and it is carried somehow by different agents, right, towards the stigma of the pistil. Okay, so this particular process of the transfer of pollen grain from the anther to the stigma, it is called as pollination. And later on, we will discuss about different pollinating agents. How does this transfer happen? Okay, now there are three different kinds of pollination depending upon the source of the pollen. So these three kinds of pollination or three types of pollination are autogamy, Geitonogamy, and Xenogamy. I want you to remember these three terms really very well. Okay, there are three types of pollination depending upon the source of the pollen, and they are autogamy, Geitonogamy, and Xenogamy. Now, autogamy means when the transfer of pollen grains happens from the anther to the stigma of the same flower, then it is called as autogamy. Meto chigyo bache, meto thaga rang ji pollen grain, meto thaga rang ji stigma gala pollinate chawa yimba ina, and pollination dinde rigla ngazu khalagre, autogamy lagre. Okay, it is clear, right? Within the same flower. Whereas Geitonogamy is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of another flower but on the same plant. 동부 찍강라로 메도 니요체 동부 찍강라 동부 다가랑갈라 메도 니요체 메도 찍가지기 pollen grain 아니 메도 셴바디 가지 stigma 갈라 차와 임바이나 로 pollination 딘데 리글랑아 주 칼라그레 Geitonogamy lagre, right? Transfer of pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of another flower but on the same plant. Now if you compare between these two, right, both of them, they won't bring about any genetic variability, right? Since the pollen grain of the same plant is landing on the stigma of the same plant, flower of the same plant, that means they won't bring about genetic variability. So these two are not preferred. Whereas xenogamy, now look at this particular term. Xenogamy, it is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a different plant. Ta di nanglo khariyo re, zishin niyor. Zishin ni gala, zishin chi gala medo jikche, zishin shimba gala medo shimba diche, and kharchi gore, the pollen grain from one plant, right, it lands on the stigma of the flower of another plant. So that is called as xenogamy, and xenogamy brings about genetic variation. So xenogamy is better in this particular manner, right? But I will tell you later on that autogamy has got a benefit of its own, right? Even though it does not bring about genetic variability, but autogamy, it has got a advantage. Okay, so let us see what that advantage is. Plants like viola, which is commonly called as common pansy, plants like oxalis and commelina, they produce two types of flowers. Right, now remember these three plants, you have to remember the names of these three plants. These three plants, they are special in the sense they produce two types of flowers. One type is called as chasmogamous flowers, and another kind of flower is cleistogamous flowers. Chasmogamous flowers and cleistogamous flowers. Now you have to remember that. Chasmogamous flowers are like any normal flower, which has got exposed anthers and stigma. They are open. The petals are open and their anthers and stigma which are the male and female reproductive parts, they are open and they are exposed. Whereas cleistogamous flowers, they are flowers which do not open at all. The petals, they do not open at all. 메도 찍하지도 카당데도 메도 가시 가려를 카 줌 되죠죠. So 카 당 되죠 되줄랑아서 칼레그레 chasmogamous legre 카 줌 되죠 되줄랑아서 칼레그레 cleistogamous legre. Right. Now both of them, they are involved in reproduction. Chasmogamous nalo la kharchi gore. In chasmogamous flowers, the pollination can happen within the same flower as well as it can happen between two different flowers. But remember, cleistogamous flowers are the flowers which do not open at all. So one pollen from one flower landing on the stigma of another flower is impossible, right? So cleistogamous flowers, it always follows autogamy. It always follows autogamy, right? Cleistogamous flower like the kache dangme wa sonza ani flower thagara nanglo lo yogi pollen grain di flower thagara nanglo yogi ani stigma gang la land chigor. So it is autogamy, right? Ngazu dinge the autogamy la jo dirwa. Okay, so now I will tell you, I told you that I will tell you the benefit of autogamy. The cleistogamous flowers, they ensure seed formation. Cleistogamous flower na lo khari seed raya guarantee re. Kharchin lawa imba pollination chunga guarantee ro thagara na lo pollination chunga pakka ro. So therefore, cleistogamous flowers, even though it follows autogamy, right? The advantage of cleistogamous flowers is that they will produce a guaranteed seed set, right? But the seeds, they don't have any genetic variability. The seeds will have the same genes as in the mother plant itself. Okay, so these are the two different types of flowers produced by these three plants. You have to remember. Okay, now next, let us discuss about the agents of pollination. What brings about pollination? Right, pollen grains, they cannot move on their own, right? So they need to be transferred by an agent, right? And there are two different types of agents of pollination. Those two agents are abiotic agents and biotic agents. Abiotic agents are wind and water. So two common abiotic agents are wind and water, right? Wind, they can carry pollen grains. Water, they can also carry pollen grains. And in the biotic agents, we have got animals. So animals, they can also carry the pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the flower. So there are two different agents, abiotic agents and biotic agents. Now let us discuss about the abiotic agents first, right? And with that regard, let us discuss about what are the features of wind and water pollinated flowers. So if you look at the wind pollinated flowers, right, since the pollination is brought about by wind, since the pollen grains are carried by the wind, let us look at the features of wind pollinated flowers. If you look at the features of wind pollinated flowers, we find that pollen grains, they are light, and they are non-sticky. Right? So pollen grains, they are light and non-sticky in wind pollinated flowers. And in such flowers, the stamens, they are well exposed. The male reproductive part they are well exposed. Exposed mein ba yimba na lungbu jedu zambala anther ne pollen grain de lungbu khithu marwa. So stamens, they are well exposed. And the stigma of such plants, they are large and feathery. Lungbu gi direction kho khasal khi se ro. So stigma, they need to be large and feathery so as to increase the chances of pollen grains landing on it. Okay, since wind can carry pollen grain in any direction the wind blows, right? So in order to increase the chances of pollination happening, the stigma, they are large and feathery. And inside the ovary, there is inside each ovary there is a single ovule, which means there is only one gametophyte in each ovule, right? And in one ovule in each ovary. And the flowers, the number of flowers in an inflorescence is numerous. There are many small flowers in a group. Inflorescence, flowers in a group. So in wind pollinated flowers, the number of flowers in an inflorescence is large. So we can take examples of corn, magenta, and grasses. So the flowers of corn and flowers of grasses, the pollination is done by wind. So you have to note down all these points regarding wind pollinated flowers. And regarding water pollinated flowers, right? So in plants which are pollinated by water, Obviously the plant will be aquatic plants which grow in water. So we have plants like Vallisneria, Hydrilla, and Zostera. Right? These plants, they grow within the water. And pollens of such plants, they are long ribbon-like structures. Right? Pollen grain long and ribbon-like. Right? And they are protected by mucilaginous covering. Mucilaginous covering, what is the benefit of mucilaginous covering is that it protects the pollen grain from getting overly wet. The water can damage the pollen grain, right? So in order for the pollen grains to be protected, it is protected by the pollen grain is protected by mucilaginous covering. Okay, and the pollen grains, they are either released onto the surface of the water, for example in Vallisneria, right? Sishin Vallisneria la chumarwe. Dinalola pollen grains are released onto the surface of the water, and the female flower, it is located on the surface, and the pollen grain the surface kan latang wa imbai na, the chances of fertilization or the chances of pollination increases, right? Or the pollens can be released inside the water. For example, seagrasses. Zostera doshnata wa imbai na, the pollen grains are released within the water. Water nanglo la release chigore, and water ran nanglo la khachigore pollination chungor. Whereas in the pollen grains of Vallisneria, they are released onto the surface. Yeah, khachigore float chigore surface kan la float che. Ani float chen yama dudu zambala, ani Vallisneria ki female flower nyam do te wa imbai na, and then pollination can occur. Okay, so this is about the pollen, the features of water pollinated flowers. Right? So you have to remember the examples: Vallisneria, Hydrilla, and Zostera. So Vallisneria S yortalo di parade. All right. Now, if you look at the flowers which are pollinated by animals, which are the biotic agents, wind and water, they are abiotic agents of pollination. Whereas flowers which are pollinated by animals are biotic agents. So animals, they are called as pollinators, and we have got different types of pollinators. We have got bees, butterflies, flies, beetles, wasp, ant, moth, and birds, right? Small birds, small bats, mammals, and reptiles, right? So we have got different types of animals involved in pollination. So they are all pollinators. But the major pollinator of angiosperms are bees. You have to remember that, right? Bees are very important pollinators. You can clearly see over here the bee. Okay, and we have to also remember that there are other animals like mammals, like bats, which are involved in pollination. Right? They carry pollen grain from one flower to the other. Now, if you look at the flowers pollinated by animals, such flowers, they are very large. Characteristic animal pollinated flowers ki characteristic the flowers which are pollinated by animals, they are large, colorful, fragrant, and rich in nectar. If we go through each one, they are large and colorful. The flowers are large and colorful because it makes the flower look conspicuous. So the animals, they can easily spot the flowers. If the flowers, they are not conspicuous, they remain hidden, the animal may miss it, right? So the flowers are large and colorful so that the flower become very conspicuous to the animal pollinators. And the fragrance and the foul smell, so the fragrance and the foul smell of the flowers, such flowers, they attracts their pollinating animals. For example, sweet smelling flowers, they can attract bees, whereas foul smelling flowers, they can attract beetles or flies. Okay, and not just that, these flowers, they also provide some kind of bribe or reward, right? For pollination, the plant, they provide nectar and pollen grains as floral rewards for the pollinators. Right? Nectar, the pollen animal nectar pollen grains can be also used as food, right? So for pollinators, nectar and pollen grain, they serve as floral reward. And such pollen grains, they are very sticky. Pollen grains, they are very sticky because they need to stick onto the body of the animals. For example, you can see the bee, it is entirely covered with pollen grains. And when the bee, it visits some other flower, it will take that pollen to the another flower, so pollination can happen that way. Another example Or another example of floral reward is some flowers like Amorphophallus, right? Amorphophallus, they so such plants or such flowers, they provide safe place for laying eggs. So the pollinators, they can lay eggs within such flowers and their eggs will remain safe, right? And then there is a yucca flower, and there is a moth which live in a very mutually beneficial interaction, right? So yucca flower and the moth, they are entirely dependent upon each other to complete their life cycle, right? So you have to remember these names: Amorphophallus, which provides a safe egg laying spot for the pollinators, and there is a mutualism between yucca and a moth, which lives in a mutually beneficial relationship, and they are both dependent upon each other to complete their life cycle. Okay, and if you look at this particular picture, you can see that the flowers of animal pollinated plants, they are specifically adapted for a particular species of animal. If you look at the beak shape of this hummingbird, and if you look at the shape of the flower over here, they both fit like lock and key, right? So they are adapted for each other. The animal is adapted to feed on the flower, and the flower is adapted to bring or attract the pollinator, specific pollinator. Okay, so that is the one. In the next video, we will discuss about outbreeding devices, pollen pistil interaction, and artificial hybridization. So please read about these topics before you watch the next video. Okay, so I hope you would remember every point that we have discussed so far regarding pollination. And if you have understood that, right, you can go forward and read about these 3 points, which we will discuss further in our next video. Thank you.